This talk is a talk that I usually give at fairly upper level meetings in organized neurosurgery to the SNS, the AANS, the summit organizations, etc. And one thing that I've learned through my participation in the ABNS over the years is that I really had no idea who or what the ABNS was when I was a resident, junior attending, and especially when I was a candidate for the oral examinations. So I want to just give a little update on what the ABNS is doing, and just sort of prepare you so you know what to expect as you go through your residency and as you start to go out into the real world. These are the current officers. Carl Heilman is the chair. I'm secretary, and then Alex Volodka is vice chair, and Kevin Cockcroft is the treasurer. Everyone thinks that Alex is the scariest person on the board, and there's some rationale for that, but he really isn't, and I'll explain to you why that is. Is somebody eating chips? Thanks. We have two new directors this year. You all know Rich Byrne, who came and was visiting professor with us about 18 months ago, or maybe longer. It doesn't seem that long ago. And Judy Huang from Hopkins has joined us on the board. And they kind of got a little bit screwed because as I came on the board, the COVID crisis happened, and so they've yet to be at an in-person board meeting. We've had a large number of Zoom and meeting room meetings, but we haven't yet to have an in-person meeting with these guys yet. Just by the numbers, currently there are about 7,200 total ABNS diplomats, of which 6,000 are active. Of these, we finally gotten to the point where there are more time limited diplomats than time unlimited diplomats. The time unlimited diplomats are a grandfathering process that happened before I became a diplomat, where there was some fear on the part of the ABNS that if they moved to modern practices of requiring continuous practice improvement or recertification, that there would be some legal liability. So we're at least at this point we're on the downslope of the time unlimited certificates. There are currently about 1,500 neurosurgery residents in 115 training programs, and as of last July 1st, 16% of neurosurgery residents were women. For the residents to know, as of last year, the directors voted to make sure that individual neurosurgery residents meet the case minimums during residency, and this is an important distinction which you may not have been aware of. But in the past, if a resident, say, didn't get their central lines in or didn't get a certain number of procedures in, the program would be cited as being deficient in that, but the resident faced there was no penalty for the resident unless it resulted in the program going on probation, which was relatively uncommon. At this point, if you have deficiencies in your case logs, it will be reported to the directors when they review your cases for eligibility for the oral examination and immediately prior to your participation in the oral examination. So if, for example, during your residency you did very, very few spine cases, the directors would almost surely want to make sure that you know how to safely operate around the spine, whether or not that is your stated subspecialty. Also, there was a vote to require residents to participate in 10 endovascular thrombectomy cases, which has now been confirmed by the RRC. So in and amongst the endovascular cases that you do, 10 of those should be endovascular thrombectomy cases. At this institution, this is nowhere near a problem. Most residents exceed these minimums by a substantial margin. But these are numbers: 300 cranial, 300 spine, 100 peds, 40 other, and 800 total cases. The primary exam in 2019 was the last time that we did it using the traditional proctored examination, and at that point I was in charge of it. You needed a 335 to pass, and of all the candidates in the United States, only 2 candidates failed, and you can see them right here, the 2 who failed. They scored more than 2 deviations below the standard, below the mean, so they failed. This past year caused us to have to do a little bit of gymnastics. So as you guys, especially Dan and Paul, know, the COVID crisis required us to reschedule the examination to May 15th. And the examination was given with virtual proctoring for the first time. We made allowances for social distancing, and residents could even take the examination at home if they didn't want to be in a facility. And there were no reported issues, at least no reported issues to us with the platform of the virtual proctoring. And as you can see, if you look on the right-hand side, we examined the highest number of examinees ever, with 857 residents taking the examination. So the virtual platform actually worked pretty well for us, and we may opt to just make this the norm especially once we perfect the virtual proctoring. So this year, virtual proctoring was done locally by volunteer faculty who would basically watch you on your webcam while you're taking the examination. This can be centralized by a service, and we may opt to do this as we go forward in the future, or we may not. We'll have to see how see how things are going in the country in general moving forward. So the examination was on May 15th. Question validation was performed on May 28th. And what is a question validation? So what we do in a question validation is we look at the statistics on every single question to see how that question performed in terms of its degree of difficulty, as well as its consonance with the overall performance of the candidates. So if a question was if a question didn't say of all the candidates, you divide all the candidates up into quintiles. So you have the top performing quintile, the bottom performing quintile, and 3 quintiles in between. If the same percentage of applicants from all 5 groups got the question right, then that question isn't really discriminating between the top candidates and the bottom candidates, and we would examine that question to make sure it was a fair question. Or if, say, the bottom quintile did better than the top quintile, we might look at that to see why that is. Sometimes the questions just weren't written very well. Sometimes there was a distractor that wasn't quite fair, and sometimes the questions were just plain hard. If they were plain hard, we left them, but if they weren't fair, we discard them. And then the analysis of the scores is done after that, so that we could send the scores out to applicants as soon as possible, because we know we were really getting up against it. And in fact, there were a number of applicants who were timing out and needed to know their scores as soon as possible. So from the day the test was taken, through the statistical analysis, through question validation, through analysis and propagation of scores was only about 2.5 weeks, which was quite the feat, as these things it usually takes about 6 weeks to get done. But we knew we had to get it done promptly. What is happening in the future? I've mentioned this to you guys in the past, but it is now official. The ABNS question bank has been reviewed and edited by the directors. We have about 2,500 questions that are suitable for continued use, meaning that they are, if they've been used before, they have good statistics. The images are acceptable; they're not out of date, and a director has reviewed every single question to make sure that that is the case. These questions, along with the images, but not the answers, are going to be released to resident candidates in March 2021 on the SANS platform. No one is allowed to charge the residents for access to these questions. SAN, however, is able to create learning modules around the questions, and they will do so in cooperation with the SNS Matrix Committee to create learning modules around the questions, and the CNS and SNS are allowed to charge residents and/or residency programs for use of those learning materials, but access to the questions is free. The majority of the written examination, probably 2/3 to 3/4, is going to be made up of these exact questions. The remainder will be made up of new questions, because we need to introduce new questions each year to the pool. It is expected the mean, median, and minimum passing score will increase substantially, meaning we're expecting folks to score between 90 and 95% correct on the examination. This is different than in the past, where a 58% was considered a passing score. We feel that by doing this allows us to guide resident didactic curriculum on an ongoing basis. The resident doesn't have to guess what we want them to know. We are going to tell them what we want them to know and ask them to know it very well. Margie Wang just took over for chair of the question writing committee. Those faculty on the line, you may be receiving a request for new questions. It's actually a lot easier to do it now. The process has been automated and substantially streamlined. So a lot of the reasons for why questions would get tossed for structural issues have now been ameliorated. And if you get through the a web-based submission process, there's a much higher likelihood that your question will be accepted for the examination. The PG 1s and 2s know about the neuroanatomy exam. This was Carl Heilmann's brainchild, and it is a examination based upon the Roten Atlas, which is on the AANS website, the Martin Neuroanatomy Text and Atlas, and then the Aids to the Examination of the Peripheral Nervous System, which we all have either in our back pockets or on a shelf someplace. And the exam consists of 100 questions, and you can take it up to 4 times until you get them right. We want every PG2 to take the resident this year, and it actually just became available the day before yesterday for use. Because of the COVID situation and because of some issues we had in terms of getting anything out in a timely fashion, you have until January to do it. You don't have to do it right away. We're going to see how things go, see how the residents do with the examination, and then make a decision as to whether or not this is going to persist as a enduring examination going forward. The original concept being that we thought that neuroanatomy was something that would be very reasonable to test junior residents on. We then imagined that there could be a critical care examination for, say, PG3 or PG4s, and then some specialty examinations along the way for upper-level residents. This is our first foray into this. I don't think it's going to develop into that type of thing in the near future, but this is our first stab at it. Now, for those of you who haven't taken the examination, I took the examination, as did the other directors. The examination is really hard if you don't study the images that it comes from. So Sarah and Niall, or actually, no, you might not have to, but Sarah and Garrett and Lars and Joyce, you really need to study the atlas in order to do well in this examination. Some of it is little bit nitpicky, and if it is too nitpicky, it'll be adjusted in the past, but we really won't know until we run it. Now, as I mentioned before, as soon as you finish your training, you're required to enroll in POST. POST stands for Practice Outcomes with Surgical Therapies, and you have to submit 125 consecutive cases with a clinical vignette and imaging, mostly pre and post-op, and with 3-month follow-up on each of these cases. This takes a lot of time to put together from the candidate, and guess what? Each case is reviewed personally by a director. We look at a director or an examiner. So, for example, I'm a director, Greg's an examiner. We look at every single case, and we will ask you questions about cases if we have questions about them. And currently, there are almost 44,000 cases in POST. One thing we've learned as we start looking at these case logs is that our more detailed case review process has raised concerns about candidate behavior. And the side effect of this is that more candidates are being invited to attend a hearing prior to sitting for the oral examination. The purpose of this hearing is to allow the board to express its concerns regarding the performance of a candidate in a straightforward fashion and to allow the candidate to explain his or her behavior to a broad panel of neurosurgeons. The alternative would be to allow the candidate to sit for the examination, fail the examination based upon their cases, and have no idea why they failed because we're generally very tight-lipped about the cause of failing for privacy purposes. So we feel that this is an opportunity for the board to express its reservations, to have the candidate stick up for themselves, and to come to some resolution prior to sitting and failing for the oral board examination. And we have a next set of hearings are coming up this coming September via Zoom meetings because of the COVID issue. Now, the POST database is clearly, we got 45,000 cases in there, clearly a very valuable repository of early career neurosurgical practice experience. And we are mining this data for purpose of improving patient safety. The mission of the ABNS is to improve patient safety by improving the practice of neurological surgery. And we hope to do this by identifying common preventable complications, identifying troublesome indications, and identifying common coding irregularities, and putting this information out there so that our membership societies, such as the WNS, CNS, SNS, or CSNS, can create educational modules around these topics, and instead of just making up topics that they think might be interesting, we can identify projects that actually have proven to be problematic for our diplomats. Now, the ABNS respects the fact that the data entry into POST is very labor intensive and difficult. And my tip to all of you when you start this is to keep it up. Don't put it off for 6 months and try to dump everything into the database at once. When as a director and reviewer get a database that was clearly put together in the 11th hour, it is obvious. And what happens is, as you're doing that, you tend to do a lot of cut and pasting, you tend to do a lot of abbreviating, you tend to repeat yourself a lot, and this comes out and it raises suspicions that the case log entry data may not be legitimate and results in a lot of queries. And often those types of databases get returned to the candidate for more information or a new data set entirely. If you time out of your board eligible status, you cannot declare yourself board eligible. If you are not board eligible or board certified, most insurance panels will not pay you. If you can't get paid, it's very difficult to hold a job. So it is important that you do this right, and it's important that you do it right the first time. Now, the ABNS is not planning on using this data to pad the CVs of the directors and friends of the board. The use of the POST data for any purpose other than to advance patient safety is not currently contemplated, and we've already turned down numerous requests from outside parties for access to the data because they're not consistent with the mission of the ABNS. So some new requirements for graduating residents. So Larry, you, Vicus, Demi, want to pay attention to this. In order for a candidate to present him or herself as board eligible, the candidate must register with the ABNS and establish a post case log prior to completion of residency or an approved fellowship. You need to let the board know if you're doing a fellowship so that they know to wait for you to be doing the fellowship. But you need to have your account set up before you finish. You need to participate in continuous certification immediately upon completion of residency or approved fellowship. This is actually not that hard to do. All of us who have time-limited certificates are already doing this. It really doesn't take all that long. It gets you a bunch of CME credits, but we want you doing this right away as opposed to waiting until after your oral examinations. We want you to enter 10 cases into post within 6 months of completing residency or approved fellowship. These 10 cases are reviewed, and you'll get feedback on those 10 cases from the directors. And mainly, we want to make sure that they're being done correctly in a structural standpoint. We're getting the information we need, and to look for early red flags, aka Chris Dunch. Dunch never came to the attention of the board because he was invisible to us because he hadn't even applied to be a candidate for the oral examination or registered for the credentials process while he was doing all his bad things. In order to try to fill that gap, this mechanism has been developed to try to give us some insight into what the very early career neurosurgeons are getting up to. The candidate still must complete the entire 125 consecutive case log within 3 years. The candidate may or may not choose to begin with the initial 10 cases. We understand people, you do your 10 cases, you're in the military, you move on, your job changes after the first year. We understand that. We just need to have 125 consecutive cases within 3 years. Those 10 cases may or may not be part of that.
Dr. Resnick, one question. Is
Sure.
that like, so I do a 2-year fellowship. Do I have in year 3 after graduating here, do I have to immediately logging 125 cases within that 3rd year post-residency?
Well, you need to register for post before you finish your fellowship.
Okay.
You will notify the ABNS that you're doing a fellowship, and so your 3-year clock begins when you finish your fellowship.
Oh, okay. Okay.
So you'll have 3 years to do it. However, I would strongly encourage you to get the process going as soon as possible.
Okay.
I think what I did and what I think makes the most sense is I started January 1st after I graduated. So I gave myself 6 months to arrive someplace, figure out where the CT scanner is, get my feet on the ground, do my first several dozen or 100 cases, and then I started January 1st collecting for my case logs. You want to get it done early. The reason being is that if your case log is rejected or you fail your first time on the orals, you got to give yourself time to complete the process within those 3 years. People used to complain, well, it's not fair because it takes forever to get to the oral examinations because there's a backlog. There is no backlog anymore. So if you can't complete this within 3 years, it's really on you. It's not on us anymore. So I would strongly recommend starting your case log submission process sometime at least within the first year of practice. I think 6 months is probably a good sweet spot. Alrighty? Now, if you don't comply with these rules, you can no longer claim to be board eligible. And as I mentioned before, if you're not board eligible, you can't get paid. In addition to this, the AAS will reach out to your chief of staff and to let them know that you're not board eligible. And amazingly enough, letting the person who is responsible for not only your behavior, but the economic health of the institution know about this has great efficacy in enforcing behavior. A grace period and reentry process has been developed. As we were talking about in the residence meeting, you have a kid, or you have a sickness, or you're in the military and you move, or you have something happens. The board will be compassionate. And so there is a grace period, there is a reentry process, but you need to keep the board informed of what's going on if that's the case. And this is going to apply to everyone who graduates as of next year. All right, next, the oral examination. In November of 2019, we examined 137 candidates. As I mentioned before, as of that point, we had completely eliminated the backlog to sit for the oral examination, and all candidates were invited to sit for the examination within 6 months of the case submission approval. So that doesn't necessarily mean that you submit your cases and you get examined within 6 months. That means you submit your cases, they get reviewed, which usually takes about a week or two. And if the review is positive, you will sit within 6 months. If there is a problem with the review, if there are queries, or if you need to submit more cases, then it can take longer. But once your case log is approved, then you will be examined within 6 months, at least as of November of 2019. Then came COVID. The May examination was postponed to November, and in November, we are now planning to examine 235 candidates in order to prevent a backlog. We're going to be using extra examiners and have extra sessions. This is all going to be done virtually. And actually, the board and some of our examiners are doing a dry run on August 3rd to make sure that the software works for this type of thing. Keep you informed. None of you are going to be taking this do we have any? I'm not sure we have any faculty taking it this time around, but it'll be the first time we do this virtually. So we're all kind of curious to see how it works. Steve Kalkanich is our oral examination chair. And I just got to say a few words about Steve. Steve took over as CEO of the Detroit health system exactly 2 weeks before the COVID crisis shut down Detroit and the hospital system there. He was president of the CNS when the COVID crisis caused the CNS meeting to cancel. And at the same time, he was head of the ABNS oral examination process when the COVID crisis caused the oral examination to be canceled twice. So if you see Steve, probably give some distance, especially in a thunderstorm, but be nice to him. He's had a very tough, very tough year. These are the results of the oral examination in terms of failure rates. In 2017 spring is when we instituted the individual cases into the examination. You can see there was a slight bump in failure rate from 14 to 21%. If you look back historically, there have been years of 20 and 19% in the past, but this went up a bit and it's pretty much stayed up a little bit higher since then. If we look at consistency over the last several years, it's been relatively consistent, but I'll show you a little more detail about this. The most common way to fail the examination is on your own cases. So of all the, we had 137 candidates, 4 failed the general only, 4 failed the focused only, and 13 failed the case reports. Of those who failed multiple sessions, they all failed the case reports, as you can see on this thing right here. Here are the exam fail rate by candidate focus. I will say I wouldn't put too much credence in this because we have noted there's been a fair amount of gamesmanship in terms of the subspecialty focus that people choose. So people, for example, even though they do 90% spine, weren't selecting spine because they were afraid of getting a hard peripheral nerve case, and instead doing general and stuff. My advice to you is report what you do. If you have a general practice, do general. You'll get double general sessions. If you are a spine person, do spine. You're going to be asked about sagittal balance. If you are a vascular person, do vascular. You're going to be asked about hard vascular cases, and similar with tumor. Do what you do. Don't try to game the system. It's really not worth it. These numbers are actually quite different from the year before, when the highest fail rate was actually in vascular, the session before this. So don't try to game the system. I think when people try to game the system, they end up screwing themselves over. Now, one thing we did do, because of the prevalence of failures in the case logs, we went and did a whole bunch of math. And what we learned is that by including the examiner, including the candidate's cases, it actually improved the examiner reliability indices compared to when the cases weren't improved. So by giving the examiners more chances to look at what the candidate is doing and knowing, it actually improved the accuracy of the examination. And based upon the statistical analysis, we intend to continue to include case presentations in the examinations. Candidates are always asking us, boy, I took the examination, how come we don't get the results for 6 weeks or so? And this is why. We do a lot of machinations to make sure the examination is fair. This is the fall oral examination update results with the results for examiner severity. As you can tell, Dr. Trost, who we all know and love, was the toughest examiner of the whole group, more than 2.5 standard deviations above the mean in terms of his severity, meaning that he scored candidates lower than anybody else by a lot. So if you were to run into Trost and say me, who is the 5th hardest, you'd think you had a really bad day, because we probably gave you a very hard time and we probably gave you some pretty low scores. But it turns out that by doing a lot of math, if Trost gives you a 2, you actually end up with a 3.14. If I give you a 2, you actually end up with a 2.32. If Dr. Camarada gives you a 3, you end up with a 1.5. So, because he's a very easy grader down here. So we have to do all this math to make sure that the candidates are being evaluated fairly. And just because you happen to walk in a room with Alex Volodka and Greg Trost doesn't mean you failed. It means you probably had a rough time, had a bad score, but actually your scores got inflated at the end to make up for that and to level the playing field. Any questions about that? Because people are always asking me why it takes so long to get these results back. And the answer is it just takes a while to compile these results, to do the math, and we hire a statistical firm called Cytent, which helps with this, and it just takes a little time to get it done. Any questions about that? Great. I mentioned continuous certification earlier. This is what it is. Basically, at this point, you need to get an email from someone who is your boss who says that you are still working at that place, you have unrestricted privileges, and you've taken care of your safety module participation, which the hospital makes you do twice a year anyway. You need to do a lifelong learning and self-assessment tool, and this is actually a test. The test is actually pretty neat. Basically, what the test is a series of approximately 20 questions, and they're all based upon level 1 evidence or well-publicized guidelines. And they provide you the references. You read the references and answer 3 or 4 questions about each one. As it turns out, it's actually kind of fun. Azam actually spontaneously emailed me saying, hey, this is really a good thing. I learned some stuff I didn't know. I was at a complications course, and a pediatric deformity surgeon stood up and said, hey, thank you so much for doing this. I was at conference and we had a case come in with a posterior fossa AVM, and thanks to reading these articles, I actually knew what I was talking about when I was being asked about it in conference. It's actually not so bad. And you also get 20 CMEs per year by doing this, which is only 4 shy of the board requirement for CMEs per year. So it's a double bang for the buck. Plus, it allows you to, it takes care of your ACS requirement for trauma certification. So you don't have to do any special trauma certification if you're working at a hospital where you're required to have such certification to work in the trauma system. The last one is meaningful participation in some sort of quality improvement process. This is undergoing a evolution at the present time, because as it turns out, there are a lot of neurosurgeons at private hospitals who don't really have access to M&M processes at their places. Or there could be an M&M, but it's a hospital-wide M&M, and you're talking with kidney docs and rheumatologists and podiatrists, and not really getting much feedback, for example. So we're making much more allowances for courses offered by the national organizations, be they in person or online. We are broadening the qualification for this. So if you are part of your hospital's risk assessment or risk mitigation council, that'll count for this as well. And that'll be more detailed on the website after September when we have our next board meeting and can vote on the changes. All 15 directors are participating in this. And the ABMS actually led all the ABMS boards in making the CC continuous certification really significantly less burdensome and hopefully useful through the adaptive learning tool that I mentioned. There is no high stakes examination. You can't fail the examination. You are prompted to continue answering the questions until you get them right. There's no case log entry, and it, as I said, it satisfies CME requirement for ACS level 1 trauma call. Enfolded fellowships. This is it. Okay. The CAST guys got a little weenie on us again this spring. This is the law. So commencing July 1st, 2021, enfolded fellowships must be taken after the trainee's chief year. As a practical matter, this means that an enfolded fellowship will be possible only in the PG7 year, and only if the trainee has been chief resident, and only if the program director deems that resident competent and capable to move on to the PG7 year. This does not apply to enfolded fellowships in critical care, which can be taken prior to the trainee's chief year and can be spread out over the training, so you don't need to do it all at once. You can do it in 3-month blocks. Seen as endovascular training, which requires an initial training experience in the performance of angiography, that year can be done prior to the chief resident year. But the second year of an endovascular interventional training fellowship must occur after the chief resident year, thus PG7. Of note, the ABNS does not require any fellowships as a requirement for initial ABNS certification. And you can do any of these things without any fellowship training. However, a fellowship may be required for neurosurgeons who wish to receive an ABMS. This is the American Board of Medical Specialties focused practice designation in certain areas of neurological surgery practice. And those 3 areas are neurocritical care, pediatric, and CNS endovascular surgery. And the reason why these are ABMS certificates is because these are all in collaboration with other boards. So neurocritical care is in collaboration with the ACGME as well as with neurology, UPN, and pulmonology. Pediatric neurosurgery is in collaboration with the ABPNS, and endovascular surgery is in collaboration with the American Board of Radiology and the American Board of Neurology. So because these are multi-board certificates, the certificate actually comes to the ABMS as opposed to the ABNS. So that's what I have. I'll open the floor for questions, and then I've got something special to show you once we finish with that. So are there any questions?